And finite transcendence for Heidegger is the condition of possibility for all access to the being of phenomena. Indeed, according to Heidegger, the condition of possibility for those merely metaphysical conditions of possibility identified by the tradition. But this condition of conditions is necessarily unconditioned. It is, in Heidegger's own words, the ecstaticon in and for itself. Recognizing the taint of idealist subjectivism in this latter, Heidegger went on to seek an even more originary access to the primordial happening, an ever more radical means of unearthing the conditions for conditions, rightness, the fourfold, etc. But the phenomenological radicalization of transcendentalism initiated by Heidegger finds itself excavating deeper and deeper into the primordial, uncovering the conditions for the conditions of the conditions. Yet the deeper it digs towards the pre-originary, the more impoverished its resources become, and the greater its removed from things themselves. Heidegger and his successors end up striving for the pre-reflexive through increasingly reflexive means, exacerbating abstraction until it becomes reduced to plying its own exorbitant vacuity. And this meta-transcendental problematic reaches some sort of apogee in Derrida, who introduces both a healthy measure of skepticism and a fatal dose of irony into the proceedings by revealing how the immediacy of access was always already contaminated by mediation or différance. Once the problematic of access and of the access to access has reached its ironic denouement in this terminally self-enclosed spiral of reflexivity, it is no surprise to see the very notion of a world indifferent to our access to it dismissed as unintelligible. But if the idea of a world independent of our access to it seems unintelligible, then perhaps the fault lies more in our notion of intelligibility than in the world. And one cannot but be struck by the ironic spectacle of the later Heidegger trying to uncover the roots of the primal phenomenon, the ur et was, in old Greek words. Phenomenology begins with the things themselves and ends up poring over words, nothing but words. And perhaps this is the inevitable denouement of the philosophy of access. This is the context in which the question of the status of Deleuze's own critical appropriation of the transcendental legacy in difference and repetition becomes particularly urgent. Like Being and Time, Difference and Repetition seeks to overhaul Kantian transcendentalism on behalf of an ontology of temporal difference. But it circumvents the problematic of access by firmly situating temporal syntheses in things, rather than any peculiarly human relation to things. But as we shall see, this audacious move threatens to clash with Deleuze's equally innovative rehabilitation of the thesis of ontological univocity, according to which, quote, being is said in one and the same sense of all its individuating differences or intrinsic modalities, end quote. That's Deleuze's own definition of the thesis of univocity in difference and repetition. Being is said in one and the same sense of all its individuating differences or intrinsic modalities, even though those differences or modalities differ from each other. And in fact, though this thesis is commonly cited as evidence of Deleuze's allegiance to Spinozist monism, it actually belies the way in which Deleuze continues to reserve a special, indeed privileged role for a special kind of being, an exceptional modality of individuation, that of the psyche. And this despite Deleuze's apparent circumvention of the problematic of access. It is not enough, writes Deleuze in Difference and Repetition, to say that consciousness is consciousness of something. It is the double of this something, and each thing is consciousness because it possesses a double, albeit very distant and very foreign to it. End quote. This elementary function of psychic doubling is performed by larval selves, whose passive syntheses of habit contract temporal differences from elementary instances of spatial repetition. Though Deleuze's theory of passive synthesis renders a larval form of psychic individuation ontologically ubiquitous at the spatial-temporal level, thereby rehabilitating a peculiar variety of panpsychism, it is the human psyche it is in the human psyche that individuation becomes fully potentiated as the differentiator of difference. Deleuze atomizes consciousness, disintegrating it into a multiplicity of larval cells, and makes of it something in the world, as opposed to a transcendental condition of access to it. But having done so, he then goes on to make that thing the privileged locus for an apocalyptic individuation, whereby, in a striking inversion of Heidegger, the future subverts the past, and death becomes the subject of a time that splits the self. For Deleuze, time, like death, is ultimately no one's. Okay, difference and repetition can be usefully summarized as a particularly audacious rewriting of Kant's first critique in the light of Bergson's Matter and Memory. But it perverts Kantianism just as it subverts Bergsonism. Deleuze perverts Kant by subjecting representation to a critique which annuls the mediating role of conceptual understanding vis-à-vis reason and sensibility. Thus, in Difference and Repetition, the tripartite structure of the first critique undergoes a bizarre involution, which folds the transcendental dialectic directly into the transcendental aesthetic. The role of the transcendental analytic is supplanted by an account of spatial-temporal individuation, which provides the sufficient reason for a non-conceptual synthesis of reason and sensibility. With the unifying function of the understanding suspended, the aesthetic manifold need no longer be subjected to conceptual subsumption. It now incarnates the dialectical structures of ideal multiplicity. Individuation becomes the synthesis of reason and sensibility. We shall consider Deleuze's theory of individuation in more detail below. But first, it is important to see how this renegotiation of the Platonic Kantian dyad, aesthetic dialectic, or sensible ideal, is given an additional twist by Deleuze's subversion of the Bergsonian dichotomy, matter-memory, or space-time, recoded in the conjunction of difference and repetition in the book's title. Each term harbours a double aspect, depending on whether it is viewed from the side of representation or grasped in and for itself. The representational characteristics of difference are identity in the concept, opposition in the predicate, resemblance in perception, and analogy in judgment. But difference in itself, as exhibited in the idea, is univocal, dialectical, problematic, and virtual. Similarly, from the viewpoint of representation, repetition is bare, material, quantitative, and reproductive. But viewed for itself, it is disguised, spiritual, intensive, and productive. The interaction between each of these four aspects is intricate. It cannot be reduced to some Manichaean opposition between temporal heterogeneity and spatial homogeneity, virtuality and actuality. Ideas as virtual multiplicities are at once expressed by intensive repetitions and enveloped by them. But at the same time, they are actualized as species and parts through the same process whereby intensive quantity is explicated as extensive quality. So though inspired by Bergson, Deleuze is not content to reiterate Bergsonian dualism, such as that between quantity and quality, difference in degree and difference in kind, or to resolve the dichotomy by simply reabsorbing the former into the latter, as a facile spiritualist monism is wont to do. In a decisive critique of Bergson on this very point, Deleuze argues that it is pointless to try to object to mechanism by insisting on the irreducibility of life to extensity, or of quality to quantity. The difference between difference in degree and difference in kind is not reducible to either. Quote, says Deleuze, between the two are all the degrees of difference. Under both lies the whole nature of difference, the intensive. And indeed, for Deleuze, it is the intensive nature of difference which binds virtual and actual, the ideal and the sensible, and provides the catalyst for individuation.